Good afternoon, everyone. Eva Hussein from Polaron here. Welcome to our session, Polaron Connects webinar series. Today we're going to be talking about the do's and don'ts of communicating with vulnerable, diverse audiences during COVID times. And we have a great pleasure to have a very special guest speaker. His name is Gauntlett, and he's the Disability Discrimination Commissioner. The reason we are very excited to have him will become apparent very quickly, but I'll just go through some housekeeping firstly. So you can ask questions. I think we've got about 75 people attending the webinar, so Andrea is going to moderate them as she usually does. Everything will be recorded, available on YouTube. Dan's reminded us that we need to caption things, which we will. There's all kinds of social media information out there, but the webinar itself, if you haven't been able to attend it or you want to share it with others, it'll be available online. And this is Ben on your screen there. I don't know if you can see him, but he's a very accomplished and I want to say illustrious person in my mind anyway. I'm very impressed. And what he does for work or who he is as a person doesn't really define him, but it's really, for me anyway, important to know that the position of the Disability Discrimination Commissioner is held by someone that has lived experience. And I'll let Ben speak about his career, I guess, or his experience and what he does at the Australian Human Rights Commission shortly. But he did in his bio, as you can see on the screen, say that he had a rugby union accident at the age of 16, and he is quadriplegic. And he's lived all over the world. That's not stopped him from doing anything that he's ever put his mind to, I'm sure. And he does have degrees in law in all kinds of other interesting fields, but he does have a Doctor of Philosophy in Law from University of Oxford. Very impressed, Ben, and welcome. We're not going to be able to see, we can hear your voice if you want to say hi.
Oh, sorry, hi, hello.
Hi, okay, thank you. So just very quickly through who we are, most of you will know that we provide language services and they range from translation to interpreting. We've just hired quite a few new people recently, which is a really good thing because we've never been busier. So it's amazing to see that out of COVID, something positive came, and that is that more and more organizations want to communicate with diverse audiences. So just moving on to the next slide. This is just some of the list. It's a list of things that we do. A lot more of our language services nowadays include co-design, which means developing resources with the community. And we do care about the quality of our work. And we do engage community with what we do. So that's me. I've already explained who I am. Then we have Ben, and we also have Nicholas, who will show us a case study today. So I started, intersectionality is something that I was familiar with, but I'm seeing more and more of that word out there. So I've started looking into what it actually means. And there's lots of definitions, and it means different things for different people. It comes from a sort of like a feminist conversation of several decades ago. But to me, it means all of who I am. I really like that expression because it means that you don't have to be one thing, and you're not one thing. You are a sum of all kinds of things, and they overlap. And in to the ways in which different aspects of a person's identity can expose them to discrimination and marginalizations, and it overlaps. And sometimes it can be empowering, and sometimes it can be oppressing. But if we move on to the next slide, but all of who I am. The other interesting thing that I found when I was researching for this webinar is that the governments, and certainly the Victorian government, has a lot of really good resources about this topic. So what you're seeing on your screen, I'm not going to go through it in a lot of detail, but that's available on the Victorian website, Victorian government's website. But your identity is made up of so many different things. The reason we wanted to talk about disability today is that often mainstream organizations forget that you can have a disability and also not to speak another language or be from a diverse background. So when they develop services or communication pieces, often there's a gap. But on the screen there, and you'll be able to find that on the Victorian Government's website, these are some of the aspects, social characteristics, I guess, and they range from age to your ability, language, religion, gender, sex, sexual orientation, etc. So the other slide talks about inequalities and exclusion. So this is just some of the examples that can be created. So it could be things like racism, and we are seeing in the era of COVID, we are seeing more racism, I guess. Some of it is anecdotal, but I think generally speaking, there are communities that feel a bit more targeted. A very good example in Victoria was of the Afghan-speaking community that were kind of, some fingers were pointed at them, and there was a lot of upset about why they were being focused on, and it had to do with the incidences of COVID, but somehow, they felt very uncomfortable with that. So that's just the list. Again, it's from the Victorian Government website. You can find it if you're interested in exploring this further. But we know also from some of the research that has been done is that these aspects that we've just listed there create more risk for people and more challenges. So, for example, we know that there's a greater risk of family violence if several characteristics are combined that we've looked at. And people also find it harder to ask for help. And this is due to systemic barriers, but also not knowing the system or not being able to orient yourselves in the system, and service providers not always making information available to those communities or members of the community. And there's also increased risk of social isolation, which double, triples, or quadruples if you have various characteristics that we've looked at. So now, before I hand over to Ben, I just wanted to talk about language. So this is, for me as a linguist, as a translator, as an interpreter, it's actually fascinating to see how the language is, language is a living thing. And, English, we watch it changing. We talk about, we use a language that's more inclusive. We use a language that's different, essentially, than even, last year or 5 years ago, or 10 years ago. But in Australia, in some communities, it takes much longer for that language to be translated in the right way so that we send the right message. So, for example, I've put a few examples. In some languages, we might still use expressions that are not acceptable anymore in English, like suffering from, or affliction, or confined to a wheelchair. We now talk about people living with a disability or having a disability, not being disabled or handicapped, or even worse, like I didn't want to list all the things that I found when, I tried to look up words that are problematic. So we need to be conscious of that. So that mainstream conversation that we have about disability, for example, actually makes it into the translations that we make. And we know that in some languages it might be more of a challenge, and we have to be really creative and inventive, but we also have to be very respectful of the people that we translate for. And certainly things like mental health issues, still in some languages there's a lot of stigma attached, and the language itself hasn't transformed yet into this exclusive conversation that we're having in the mainstream. So now I'm going to hand over to Ben. I've finished my bit. Hopefully that's given you something to thought about. There are a lot of resources out there that can provide more information for you. The key is to be respectful of the people that you speak to. And with that, over to you, Ben, and thank you so much for being part of this webinar today.
Thank you very much, Eva. I'd firstly like to start off by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet. I sit upon Gadigal land of the Eora Nation in Sydney, and I'm sure we all sit upon different land all across the country. And I acknowledge any Aboriginal elders in the audience today, past, present, and also those who are emerging Aboriginal elders or people of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander descent who are in the audience today. I note on the expression of when you talked about language, there is no word for disability amongst Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia, and that's something that I've been informed of many times about the inclusive nature of their culture. I've got a very brief presentation of 5 slides to go with today, and what I wanted to do is to really just take you through what is the disability rights framework that exists in Australia, to relate that a little bit back to the need of culturally and linguistically diverse populations, and finally then to talk about some of the issues that are going forward with COVID-19, and in particular how you might consider dealing with those issues in a way that's progressive and thought-provoking, and also to acknowledge the policy setting upon which disability rights exist in Australia, so that you can have a better understanding of maybe that, for example, how many people are affected by certain issues, or how things can be advocated for in a better way. Go to the next slide, please. I'm going to start off by describing the nature of human rights for people with disability in Australia. I'm then going to relate that back to culturally and linguistically diverse populations. Finally, I'm going to give an example of some guidelines we've produced on the rights of people with disability in health and disability care during COVID-19. And then I'm going to try and outline some issues going forward, which Polaron may consider, but also should be considered just by the whole society more generally, particularly as it relates to people with a disability from a culturally and linguistically diverse background, and some of the challenges that they may face in Australia and across the world. Next slide, please. The critical human rights treaty, which is relevant to Australia and sets out the rights of people with disability, is the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability. And on the slide there, I have a summary of, in a sense, the articles of the convention, and taken at the 10-year anniversary mark of 2016. Australia ratified the convention in 2008. It was one of the first countries to ratify the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and it did so on the first day. And the treaty itself is kind of a novel document in that it has both within it some general propositions relating to equality and non-discrimination. It then acknowledges particular groups such as women and children with disabilities and the challenges they may face, before going into other domains that might be considered as they relate to people with disability. Examples of those domains include, for example, that a person with a disability should be supported to make their own decisions. And this is particularly relevant to Polaron and its language services, because you may be asked to interpret for a person who may have an intellectual disability to explain what they want in a particular situation. And it's important to acknowledge that at a human rights level, people with disabilities should be supported to make their own decisions. Also, that people with disabilities should not be forced to go into forced medical treatment without their consent. There should be consent to ensure that they are at all times understand what's occurring in relation to what they do. We need to understand that there shouldn't be things like forced sterilisation, and that there should be appropriate housing, work and education for people with disability where they are part of mainstream settings. They're not in a separate setting, but they're included in the mainstream. And that applies just as much as people who come from a culturally and linguistically diverse background as people who do not come from a culturally and linguistically diverse background. Now, to assess our compliance with the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, Australia is assessed periodically. Our previous periodic review was in Geneva last year, and what I think was found is that we had a mixed outcomes in terms of what had occurred. There were several really good outcomes, such as the existence of the National Disability Insurance Scheme, but also a long way to go in areas such as education, health and migration. And one of the things that occurs under the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities is that each year there is, in a sense, an exchange of information that takes place in the United Nations called the Conference of State Parties. And Australia sends a delegation of people with disabilities to this conference. And the reason why I raise that is one of the critical issues that keeps coming up is the notion of communication disabilities. That is, that people who may have difficulty communicating what are their views in certain situations, and yet because of that, can be ostracised from society or not able to participate on an equal basis to others. Now, the CRPD is obviously, it's an international treaty signed by many parties. It's signed by the European Union. And the photograph I have there is when I was invited to Brussels last year to give a speech. And that's me meeting with European Commissioner Dalli, who was just appointed in relation to disability issues. And they have a European disability strategy. And we also have a national disability strategy, which is designed to implement all our obligations under the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Now, you've probably all heard of the National Disability Insurance Scheme. Only 10% of Australians living with disability are eligible for the National Disability Insurance Scheme. There are 4.4 million Australians who have a disability, but only about 440,000 of them are eligible for the National Disability Insurance Scheme. And the vast preponderance of disability is invisible in nature. So it's not all about people in wheelchairs. It's about people who have communication disabilities. It's about people who may struggle with hearing. It's about people who have sensory issues. It's about people who may be neurodiverse. It's important that you acknowledge that not all disability is visible when we're dealing with disability as it relates to other diversity characteristics. As I said, we have a national disability strategy that's actually been reviewed this year. It's a once in a decade policy document, and it's agreed upon by state, federal and territorial government. Some of the outcome areas that are looked at within that national disability strategy are economic security, inclusive and accessible communities, personal and community support, rights protection, justice and legislation, learning and skills, and health and well-being. We could go to the next slide, please. And one of the critical concerns relating to disability as it exists under the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons, and also its implementation through the National Disability Strategy, is to ensure that people do not experience double disadvantage or intersectional disadvantage as a result of being potentially from a different racial background and having a disability. And I've put on that slide there a number of the issues that can crop up relating to disability and culturally and linguistically diverse persons. Obviously, racial discrimination can occur to all people, but when it is combined with a person having a disability, the effects can be far more pronounced. We need to understand also that at present in Australia, our migration laws are designed in a way that means that a person with a disability is discriminated against in trying to come to Australia. And this is something that hopefully over time government will see, or should, they should do it right away, change. We need migration laws that are not discriminatory in nature and are understanding of human rights concerns. In terms of cultural awareness and disability, we know that for applying for programs and certain health issues, such as the National Disability Insurance Scheme or interacting with health systems, that people from culturally diverse backgrounds have poorer outcomes. I mean, that needs to be addressed. And one of the reasons for that is that not all communication is accessible for people with disability. And when you combine that with the need to, for example, access language services that are different to what is the native language of the people providing the service, can be incredibly problematic in terms of ensuring the person receives appropriate outcome. There's also a need to understand that in certain cultures, disability is viewed in a different way. And it may be viewed that a person has a sense of shame in admitting they have a disability. And that can be very problematic, for example, for children to ensure they get appropriate early interventions on certain issues. So it's important to attack issues of disability for culturally and linguistically diverse persons through two lenses, both a disability lens, but also a culturally appropriate lens to understand those issues. And this access to services and disability is a real problem in the NDIS. It's one the National Disability Insurance Agency is looking at, but will take time to resolve. Okay, if we could then go to the next slide, please. So what the Australian Human Rights Commission does is we try to guide policy in relation to areas such as disability. We also guide issues such as those relating to race discrimination. And during COVID-19, you probably all heard a number of particularly concerning stories in foreign countries about people with disabilities being placed in circumstances where they were not able to receive appropriate health care. As a result of that, we produced some guidelines for people with disability as they exist in Australia. And what we wanted to do with those guidelines is to make sure that people understood the importance of reasonable accommodation. And although in the guidelines as they've been produced, they're produced in a health and a disability services context, what they have in them is a series of practical examples. So access to mobility aids, accessible communication, access to visitors and families. And when you're providing interpreter services, or when you're helping someone to communicate, one of the things that we would ask that you remember is the importance of understanding reasonable accommodation. That is that you don't always provide services identically to every single person. What you can do is provide services differently for the same outcome. Next slide, please. So in terms of the issues to consider going forward, what I would say is obviously it would be helpful if culturally and linguistically diverse persons are understanding of the disability policy framework that exists. But the critical issue for people with disability who come from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds is when they are being provided with services, those persons who are there to help them can try and explain that they do have the ability to ask for reasonable accommodations to accommodate their disability to ensure they are included. You, as an interpreter, may occupy a very privileged position where they look at you as an objectively pragmatic voice in a discussion. And if you can say to a person, no, you are eligible for services, or why don't we inquire about these services existing and let's see if you can be assisted, is incredibly important. So I'd be happy to take any questions on the intersection between culturally and linguistically diverse persons and people with disability in Australia, but I thought I might leave it there and I think hand over to Nicholas.
Yeah, that's been a great overview of your work, and I think we now get the sense, if we didn't before, of how incredibly important and empowering it is for people that have a disability and other sort of limiting factors, I guess. And you're absolutely right there, Ben, that we live in a society where perhaps a little bit too much of what we do is ticking of boxes, I guess, or, it is all about tailor-made services as much as possible. So I'm going to hand over to Nicholas now to show you what one organization that has worked with us did and what the process was. Feel free to continue asking questions. There's a Q&A panel at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to them at the end of the session once Nicholas is done.
Thanks so much, Eva and Ben. Just briefly, I want to touch on a couple of points there that Eva and Ben have mentioned, one being intersectionality and the other being marginalization. Two of those points are really, really important in our society here in Australia. And I think that when it comes down to it, there are some organisations that are tackling those points a little bit better than others. And that's why I'm here to kind of highlight how it can be done. One, I'm going to spotlight Cerebral Palsy Alliance. Thank you for letting us present on your resources as they are best practice. And I want to show you the ways in which you guys can implement it as well for your organisations to increase that accessibility that we've been talking about today. Now, as Ben just touched on briefly before, I think there is a bit of a misconception that disability and CALD communities don't intersect, which is something that goes amiss amongst a lot of service providers here in Australia. And it's something that needs to be looked at in a little bit more depth because it's definitely not the case. I've put a statistic here, and Ben even said it in his presentation. There are 4.4 million people in Australia live with a disability. Out of those 4.4 million, we've got 18% that come from a CALD background. Now that's staggering when we look at that number alone. And the fact that that misconception where CALD and disability do not intersect is really, really worrying. Now, CPA, I'm going to call Cerebral Palsy Alliance CPA because it is a bit of a mouthful, are one of those organisations that actively look to eliminate that barrier and that misconception. And so they've been working and exploring ways with Polaron as to how they can increase their accessibility and not only reach their audience and their market, but also reach the CALD side of things as well. Now, when we think of marginalization of people living with a disability, it becomes 10 times more isolating when we couple that with CALD communication and CALD accessibility. And this is something that I always put an emphasis on, obviously because we are a language service provider, but I think there needs to be more emphasis drawn on it by those service providers. NDIS, as Ben said, 10% are only receiving their services. There needs to be more of a focus on getting those services out there, specifically to those CALD communities as well. Now, CPA are just one of those organisations, and now I'm highlighting these guys because they have worked with us for a while and we are exploring more options with them now, but there are plenty of other organisations that do exactly the same thing, so props to everyone out there that is doing it. But they're an organisation that works with families for better outcomes with those living with cerebral palsy, but other neurological and physical disabilities. But as I've highlighted here, more importantly, they're doing it in a CALD safe way, which is what we love to see, and it's what communities around Australia love to see as well. Now I'll move on to the next slide, and I'll just explain briefly how CPA are doing this. And while we're glancing through these, you can see some of the resources that I'm putting side by side here, and it's just a typical approach from CPA. They generate a lot of resources, and right now, and most definitely through to the future, they will be looking to translate and get these resources out to the communities that need it. But the key points of difference with CPA and then your regular old service provider who's not necessarily taking into account all aspects is, one, they look at doing translations the proper way. And the proper way, and a lot of people have heard me ramp on about it before, but we call it community approved translations here. If you've heard it elsewhere, it might be community checked or community consulted. It's basically where we're actually reaching out to the community and getting their advice back on translations. Now, CPA are very avid on doing this with Polaron, and as should other service providers, because it does lead to better outcomes for our audiences and for our consumers. If we're going to translate things, yes, we can cover it with a NADI stamp, and that is great. That is a great bit of quality assurance. But we need to actually consult the community on what their needs are, what they'd actually like to receive from these resources, and how it's going to benefit them. And that happens when we go with a community approved service. Passive language. Now, Eva spoke about this briefly before, but it's how we use our words these days. In Australia, as a very progressive society, we tend to use, less stigmatizing words for disability and CALD communities. However, in other communities, CALD communities, that may not be there yet. And that's why we need to look at the way we're using our language and actually mold our approach in terms of CALD communication to suit disability a little bit more and be less stigmatizing. Plain language. This is also something that we've spoken about in other webinars before, and that we currently are exploring with CPA, looking at reviewing a resource before you put it out there. A lot of service providers, especially when it comes to disability, don't quite understand that some of the content in your English resources might be very difficult to comprehend for your consumers. Because you come across it every day, and the common words you always see, it may not be too complicated for you, but for our end users, we need to really make sure that we're using plain language and simplifying that resource so that it can be disseminated easily and received easily. Fourth point here is multiple mediums. I've ramped on about this quite a lot in the past as well, as is Eva, but you need to look to innovate a little bit as well. Currently with CPA, we're exploring doing voiceovers and recordings and print resources as well. That's diversifying their communication. And what that's going to do, it's going to increase their accessibility and their reach. And by way of virtue, it's going to lead to better outcomes for those living with a disability. And then the last point here, and just really quickly before I finish up, it's just including and not isolating marginalised communities. I really want to try and push that barrier away and get out of people's head that CALD is one thing and disability is another, because it's definitely not. And statistics prove that. There's nothing else required for anyone to see that CALD and disability do intersect. And it's about how we can tailor our approach as service providers to suit the needs of CALD and disability communities. So I'll leave you with that. And once again, thanks to CPA for letting us use the resources. You guys are doing a great job, as are many other organisations out there. Feel free to reach out with any questions you might have, guys. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Nicholas. And we do have examples of other resources on our website. And, you know, we've spoken about it many times, but of course we also have resources other than translations that we encourage people to consider. So from podcasts to videos and smaller chunks of content so that people don't feel so overwhelmed. But I encourage people to ask a couple more questions. We've got lots of questions for you, Ben. So I'll hand over to Andrea, but if anyone else wants to cover anything else, there's a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Please go for it. Over to you, Andrea.
All right, thank you so much. Regarding Ben's suggestions on what interpreters can suggest, I think it is problematic as interpreters are restricted in what they can do. Someone is saying that the role is to interpret what is being said, which might involve interpreting information that they know to be incomplete. It is important not to expect them to provide information through their interpreting assignment. Not sure if Ben wants to comment on that.
Sure. I think there's a distinction though between doing your interpreting job, which is obviously very important, and being part of that, and having disability awareness. And disability awareness may be saying at the start of the job, saying, oh, I realise this person cannot hear us. Have we thought of looking at this another way? Or we need to look at something different in order for us to do our job. So I think that whilst the issue of sort of, obviously you have to be reflective of what you're engaged to do, doesn't mean you have to do it without being aware of the needs of people with disability when you're doing it. And that's what I was trying to convey.
Yeah, and I think it's a fantastic question, and Ben, the way you described reply to it is what I would also say, because there's the human aspect. So I remember when I worked as an interpreter, it was drummed into us basically, you're only there to be a conduit, you're only there to do the interpreting. And there was so many times where I would walk out of a situation and just feel that I haven't done my job properly, not because I was a bad interpreter, but because I was experiencing and witnessing the human factor of people being disadvantaged and not really knowing what to do. So if I can add to what Ben has said just now, is that you know, we are humans, we're not robots, we don't turn up to interpreting assignments you know, as robots. On the other hand, that fine line between doing your job but also seeing a person there that may be marginalized or disadvantaged is a challenging one. So one of the things that interpreters could potentially do, or service provider could potentially do, is have a conversation. Just talk about it, you know, yes, in front of the client, and engaging them and interpreting that for them. Because we're not, you know, we shouldn't work in silos and just say, right, that's my job done, and I'm going to go to the next appointment where you know that, you know, what just happened isn't right. So there's that aspect of it as well. And I do acknowledge that it's a massive challenge for interpreters, because we've always been told through our training and through everything we do, do not get involved. So, you know, I think each of us as a professional person, as a professional interpreter, needs to reconcile. But I think it is about knowledge and about respecting the individuals that you're working with, and being aware of appropriate terminology, of the respect that you need to show. And maybe even saying to the, you know, the service that you're interpreting for, I'm concerned. What do I do about this? Please debrief with me, right? So not just sort of popping in and out of interpreting sessions and moving on very quickly when you know that something is not quite right.
And an aspect of that is upfront, before you even begin the role, to say, have we considered the accessibility issues that are needed? So, or saying, you know, have we considered the needs of the people that are, and when we're dealing with people with disabilities as consumers or as customers, it's incredibly important that we understand that we have to co-design, That is, ask the person with a disability what they need. And by asking the question up front, by being quite transparent about it, I think you give better service, but also you can deal with these issues in a way that's transparent and respectful and dignified, and ensure that everyone's included in the service that you're offering.
Absolutely, and I honestly couldn't agree more. I think it is about, you know, when you consider doing your job as an interpreter, yes, it is about language, but it is about communication as well. So if the communication is failing, I think we as interpreters have that obligation. Or if you're translating something for a community and you think, you know what, like people aren't actually going to be able to read it, you need to speak up. And certainly in my time as an interpreter, I've worked with families that were born Australia, and their English wasn't you know, their first language. But they had a child who, even though was born in Australia, they may not have English as a first language either. So there's lots of different layers and lots of different complexities that, you know, I wish we could, you know, solve communication issues, but it's one communication assignment at a time, one interpreting assignment at a time. If I can just, you know, I know I'm laboring that point, but you cannot be passive participants and pedestrians watching this happen, right? I think it's also about, you know, wearing that professional hat and thinking, okay, what do I do? I'm witnessing this situation. What do I do as an interpreter?
All right, thank you so much, guys. Next question. How does the concept of disability changed over the last few years? Maybe Ben or Eva can cover that one.
I'll hand over to Ben. I think he
Sure.
can probably talk.
Historically, we had what's known as a medical model of disability, where you just focused on, in a sense, the person's deficit. So I'm a wheelchair user, so someone would look at me and they'd just be like, wheelchair user. And that's, in a sense, what would define me. And then we moved on to what's termed the social model of disability. And the social model of disability looks at the laws and procedures that exist around the person, and they are what, in a sense, creates the issue with the person interacting with society. And I think now what we've moved on to is a rights model of disability, where we understand that each and every person has human rights and needs to be treated with dignity and respect. But those rights are balanced against other considerations in the community. And a good example with COVID would be that there is a balance between the health restrictions and freedom of movement. And so what we are now getting to is a situation where we're getting a more progressive view of how people with disabilities. But I think the best way to think of disability is an aspect of a person. It doesn't define the person unless they choose for it to do so.
That is so very interesting in how all of that is changing before our very own eyes, and some of it isn't really making it into diverse communities yet. So I think what I find just being an observer, but also a participant, I mean, I don't personally don't have a disability, but I know many people that do. And if a language barrier is there, that makes it harder, and it takes longer for those concepts to actually reach communities. And I have a colleague, a friend, Ljubica Petrov, her name is, she used to work for the Center for Cultural Diversity in Aging. And she tells this story where, so they would consult with the aged care providers. And she tells this story where somebody rang her one day from an aged care facility and said, we have this Korean man and he needs a new wheelchair. Where do I get it from? And I kid you not, it's a true story. Like, and she was like, what do you mean? Like, he needs a wheelchair, get a wheelchair for him. What difference does it make that he's Korean? Like, you know, so people kind of get this blind to all kinds of things like that. So, and there are many, many examples of that. So, but what Ben you have just said is that that intersectionality of a person, of a human being, is ever more important when you look at how to support that person in their daily lives. I think that's what I'm hearing. All right,
thank
Angie.
you. Okay, thank you so much. Next question. What are the Commission's plans for the future?
Well, there are a number of different commissioners, and each commissioner has a work sort of plan. Ed Santo, for example, is the Human Rights Commissioner. He's presently looking at a Human Rights and Technology project. Kate Jenkins is the Sex Discrimination Commissioner. She's just released a big report relating to discrimination in the workplace, which she's looking to operationalise. There's also some broader work going on about discrimination and how discrimination can be made in a way that appreciates the intersectionality of it, and also the practicality of discrimination law being used. And on that note, I should note that the highest characteristic or diversity characteristic that results in discrimination complaints is disability. Over 40% of the Commission's complaints relate to disability. Going forward, I'm going to be dealing with the National Disability Strategy this year because it's a once-in-a-decade document. Try and get that as fit for purpose as possible. There's another policy area called the National Disability Data Asset that we're hoping to get become operational. And the reason why the National Disability Data Asset is so important is at present we create a lot of disability policy in Australia without having a basis of measuring whether it's effective or not. We need to be much better at working out whether it's effective or whether it's needed. And the two other areas that I'm very passionate about are employment, the employment of people with disability, and housing. We need to make sure that housing is fit for purpose for people with disability and they can have houses. Obviously, COVID has meant there's been a need to focus on that issue for now, but now that some of the restrictions and the nature of COVID is becoming more understood, I think we can get back to really focusing upon those policy areas.
Thank you so much. Ben, where can we find more information, let's say, about CALD audiences and disability?
On what?
About CALD audiences and disability.
There is a disabled persons organisation called the National Ethnic Disability Alliance. They have a lot of information, and so do some other organisations like SSSI have information relating to CALD audiences and people with disability. The National Disability Insurance Scheme has, or agency rather, provides funding to certain organisations to look into issues. One of their target areas is CALD communities and the NDIS, and so that will also result in some better materials being produced.
Thank you. Tina would like to know, so how do we overcome, as she said, you made a really great point about language, about disability in different languages not being inclusive and no longer being relevant in English. How do we overcome this and strike the right balance? Is using inclusive, positive language in translation the way forward?
I think it is, and thank you, Tina, for asking that question, because it is about, translators or the language professionals, whether it's interpreters, bilingual educators, or, when you work with languages other than English, I think you also have a responsibility for the language you use. When we produce resources, we do consult with, firstly, the service users, secondly, a range of translators in each language, and sometimes we have to create new words and new concepts because we know that some of the stigma that's out there still a little bit is just to do with educating people about how to do it better. So, I remember when I first started, we were in the mainstream, we were talking about dementia. We were talking about mental health, and in Australia, the language we use and the expressions we use when we talk about people really matter. So making that switch or making that journey into languages other than English are extremely important, and it's a responsibility of language professionals. But also, if you're a service provider and you're working on developing resources, what I would be strongly advocating is thinking about that 18% that Nicholas has put on the screen. Okay, so roughly about 20% of your audience, whoever they may be, might have a language issue. one thing you could do is develop resources that are plain English, but also provide information about what your language means to translation, companies or translators. So if you have a particular way of talking about particular things, or particular things are important to you, it's also key to make that known, because sometimes people, like when you read stuff or translate stuff, you might not think about what it'll say in another language. Yeah. So I think it's an industry-wide responsibility that we all have, to hijack some of this stigma and conversation and make it into a better outcome for people that are going to read your resources or watch your videos. And it's also about accessibility and having those conversations with your translators or whoever you're working with. But it does start with you in how you think about who you're going to be communicating with. So when you write your resources, we are more and more aware, but we need to be even more aware of who is going to read it, who's going to be looking at it, and how to make it more accessible to people that are very diverse. And all that intersectionality that we spoke about at the beginning is about that too. So sometimes those conversations with translators need to get down to thinking of, okay, we have an issue, we as an industry or we as a language group, how do we overcome that? We no longer talk about people, disabled people, we talk about people with a disability. How does that translate into other languages? And I think, translators also need to feel empowered about changing those conversations and how those translations actually sound better in the end, and it's a better conversation for the community as well.
Thank you so much, Eva. There's one more question. This one is for Nicholas. How are CPI considering health literacy levels or preferred learning styles for CALD communities? How did they decide which languages to translate into?
Okay, I love that you've just asked that question. Tina has just kindly replied in the chat to reply to Gemma. But Gemma, I'll read out Tina's answer. I'll also tell you a little bit about the ways in which Tina and I have been working together to combat that exact point, which is the preferred learning styles and the health literacy levels. So Gemma, Tina's reply is just, we did lots of research into which CALD communities were most prevalent near our sites, and the data showed there were 3 CALD groups, so we focused on these. In essence, that is correct, but Tina's also gone with the languages that represent her audience and consumers the most. Now, you don't need to be the language service provider that translates into 50 languages or 150 languages, because there's not enough time and money to do that for every single resource you have. If you can pick the main groups that your consumers are within or represent, then that's what you should shoot for. And that's how I think all organizations and service providers should look at picking their languages, because not everyone has the budget and time to go through every single one. If you can find those 3, 5, 1 main group that you can target, then just go for that. Take it one step at a time, I guess. And with regards to health literacy and preferred learning styles as well, I've mentioned briefly in my slides that changing mediums does help. Moving to voice recording is something that combats literacy levels in every language. Eva and I often talk about how reading is becoming obsolete nowadays. People are becoming more and more bored with long books, and we like to hear information. We like to watch videos. So if you can expand into that kind of medium, you'll be combating health literacy in a really good way. So so to elaborate on what Tina said, and that's basically where we're at with CPA, I guess.
Excellent. Look, that sums things up really well. So it is my pleasure now to thank all of you that have attended this webinar. I hope everyone's come away with some new knowledge, but also you feel more empowered and invigorated to try and explore this thing. So we can't, of course, give you a magic wand today, but what we have given you is Ben, who very succinctly and very eloquently talked about the work he does and the work that the Commission does. So I wanted to thank Ben sincerely for being part of it. And, you know, the website of the Commission has got a lot of information, and Ben's mentioned other organizations, but it is about doing our own research and feeling empowered to do so. So thank you, Ben, thank you, Nicholas, and thank you, Andrea, as always, for being behind the scenes and making it happen. So what I'm going to do now is just for the last few words, I'll hand over to Ben with thanks for being part of today.
Oh, thank you very much, Eva, and it's been great to speak with you and to hear both you and Nicholas, and also to all the people who are attending today. The thing I just try and advocate is that good disability policy or respect for people with disability is good practice generally. Asking the question of, is this accessible for you? Do you understand? How can I best assist you? In a respectful way is a great way to provide service to anyone, even if they have a disability. And being open and understanding that a lot of disability is unseen and being respectful of where it is does become apparent is incredibly important. We know that 4.4 million Australians live with disability, but also that 80% of approximately 80% of disability is acquired during the totality of someone's life. And so what that means is having services that are disability friendly are good services that are future-proofed for the country and are necessary. And especially when people are in times of need, such as in health crises or in traumatic situations, having a respectful and understanding ability to communicate is incredibly important. So I was delighted to be here, and I hope I've been of some assistance to maybe opening up a dialogue about being human rights friendly when you're providing your services.
And you definitely have, and that's a fantastic summary. And we are very grateful for your presence and everybody else. So thank you. Have a great afternoon, everyone.